All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to EMPM. That stands for Engineering Major, Philosophy Minor. It is October 29th, 2021. It is a nice Friday afternoon, actually. It's about 3:42 p.m. Let me let you guys know again that EMPM is the channel where you can get a working aerospace engineer's opinions on topics pertaining to engineering, philosophy, politics, and various other social and cultural issues. And as you know, the social, the cultural, the political, the philosophical, and to a certain degree, the technical perspective in engineering do all combine together in a lot of ways to form public policy and various things like that. And so we talk a lot about politics, but really politics has its fingers in all of these other things, or actually it's maybe more the other way around. All of those various subdivisions have their fingers in politics. So let me just briefly explain to you guys what's happening in the county right here. Of course, I'm working on the county of Citrus Valley right here. In the last couple of videos, we had completed that freeway exchange that you see there on the right, on the left. And also I had added this small little industrial area right here, which has a couple of different factories in it that, take products from the oil industry run by Eddie Loesch and the forestry industry from Mr. Steelstream. So right now, I'm just going to be finishing out this minor industrial area right here, and also just kind of finishing out the university campus, and then I do some decorating. But we'll see how long the written piece I have is today. Maybe I won't get through the entire thing before the end of this video, in which case there'll just be a different topic where all that stuff that I just talked about was finalized. So that being said, guys, in today's video, we're going to talk about something that is, well, I don't want to say controversial, but it is, how can I put this? It's, if you're somebody who is religious, who grew up in, a religious family or with a religious background, it's something that is kind of a taboo topic, and that is the topic of pornography. So I've written a piece here, and what we're going to be talking about in this video primarily is, why is kind of answering the question, why is pornography so ubiquitous in our culture? Why is it so appealing to so many men? And, in a way, actually, being a performer is actually really appealing to a lot of women. That's maybe a topic for another video, but let me go ahead and just start reading what I wrote, and we'll go from there. It's hard for me to know where to begin on this topic, not because the subject matter in and of itself might be illicit, but because there is a reason this topic was called illicit in the first place. In fact, I would not be surprised if many words such as illicit, licentious, derogatory, uncouth, and taboo were invented with the intent of describing what I want to discuss in today's video. I was watching the podcast You Are Here, featuring Elijah Schaefer and Sydney Watson. 10 out of 10 would recommend to a friend. The topic being discussed was masculinity or lack thereof in culture. Not very long after, the conversation evolved naturally to men and boys' consumption of pornography. I say naturally because just about every conversation regarding masculinity and or femininity in culture ends up in discourse about acceptable and unacceptable forms of sexual behavior. Why? Hold that thought. Elijah posed an interesting question to Sydney and their guest. To paraphrase, he inquired whether the issue of prawn addiction, and we call it prawn sometimes because sometimes if we say the short version of pornography or even maybe pornography, YouTube gets upset, but he inquired whether the issue of prawn addiction was a planned and malevolent act. His words seem to suggest that large corporations, even those who may not produce actual prawn, will for men to become less masculine. One method that collusion between governments and corporations might employ to make men more effeminate is to ensure that men and boys become dependent on digital forms of erotic entertainment. Elijah himself admits that this sounds conspiratorial, but given where we are in culture and society, he also notes that many of us have no idea how to separate conspiracy and coincidence. Elijah is half correct. There is indeed a will for men to consume certain types of content online, just as there is a will from corporations for people to consume goods and services in general. However, I believe that Elijah is incorrect in assuming that there is a collusion between corporate interests and government interests with respect to pornography and emasculating men. The pornography industry has an incentive to keep men's sexual appetite ravenous, which is a hallmark of masculinity, whereas the government has a motivation to continually expand government. This requires men to be more docile and complacent with central control. But the progression can start to seem conspiratorial because pornography addiction is a symptom of behavior in men that is consistent with the needs of government for subservience. More important than inquiring if a cabal of corporate and government elites are colluding to promote Prawn and effeminate men is the question of why do men buy into it? Why are men so drawn to fantasy interaction over real interaction? In order to answer this question, one needs to start with a few premises. First, typical behavior of men is dictated in large part by the response they get from being rewarded for certain behaviors by interaction with women in the real world, non-digital. Second, the government and politicians in today's world, particularly Democrats, have an interest in promoting what they deem as popular, rather than adhering to the fundamental values and tenets of the United States of America. Third, feminism and women's empowerment is extremely popular. In accordance with these three premises, one can surmise that the pornography industry, in a quest to simply provide a service for customers, benefits from impacts to both genders and government intervention in a convenient but likely coincidental feedback loop. The first part of this feedback loop is a fundamental truth about masculinity. Most of men's behavior towards women and even other men is guided by a subconscious desire to be attractive to women. If you're a man watching or listening, think back to all the things you've likely done to try and woo a woman or try to keep her around. Maybe it was things like expensive dinners, elaborate date ideas, flowers, poetry, or vacations. Perhaps it was items central to your life, switching careers, moving, renting an apartment, paying her debt, or even exploring polyamory. Why did you do all these things? Like me, you probably desired a combination of validation and sexual intimacy. After all, is there any better confirmation to your worth as a man than a woman who adores you and tells you how big you are, even if you know she's lying? The extents to which men will go to achieve this validation seem limitless, and many men will sacrifice alternative elements of their manhood in order to satisfy this longing. Don't worry, fellas, I've been there more times than I'd like to admit. The second part of this feedback loop results in a core aspect of femininity, the biological desire to find the most suitable male with whom to procreate. What makes a male suitable? This is the quintessential question that most men have been banging their heads against the wall to figure out for some time, especially in an era where the culture denigrates masculinity as toxic, oppressive, and patriarchal. The idea of toxic masculinity is an idea that will be grappled with shortly, but requires returning to the idea of the suitable male. Women will often gauge men relative to other men, but setting gender aside momentarily, human beings of either gender tend to gauge people relative to themselves. For men, this results in competition amongst each other, but for women, this results in hypergamy. Hypergamy warrants a whole video on its own, but a sufficient definition for the purpose of this video is that women prefer to date and/or mate across, in other words at an equal level, or upward in a social hierarchy. This means that women, generally speaking, will sort men relative to their own position in said hierarchy, both in terms of physical and social elements. For example, physically, women prefer men who are taller than them. A social example is that women prefer men who make more money than them. The listener may now complain that this isn't true everywhere and always, and the listener would be correct. There are notable exceptions that happen. Let me consider one: the starving artist or musician. Many women might chime in and say they either know someone or dated someone themselves who is taller than them, but did not make nearly as much money because they are a musician who performs frequently at a local venue but is not famous. Chances are this musician is either the only, the best, or the most physically attractive musician among the group of other male musicians that she interacts with. If the woman is not herself a musician, it is easy to see that she is selected upward in the social hierarchy of musicianship. But again, this second step is meant to apply more often than not, rather than a hard scientific rule. Allow me to leave this step with saying simply, women desire to find the most suitable mate, and they do so often, but not always, with a hypergamous selection criteria. Third in the loop is the social influence of feminism, which is the primary originator of ideas like tyrannical patriarchy, toxic masculinity, and unquestionable systemic oppression of women throughout history. The ideology of equitable treatment of women, as opposed to equal treatment, posits that retribution in the form of redistribution is the only means by which systemic oppression can be remedied. This prescription calls out for total subversion of the traditional meritocracies that have driven the successes of both men and women in human civilization. Instead, so-called positions of power, which is really a stand-in term for any position in society that looks more comfortable and successful than one's own life at the moment, should be distributed not by individual achievement, competence, or diligence, but instead based on identity group status and its representative percentage in a selected population. For example, consider the equity policy of women in STEM fields. STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. One could study the population of men versus women STEM applicants to major engineering schools. For sake of example, let's say the applicant pool is 70% men and 30% women. Now consider the United States overall population demographic, about 50-50 in terms of men and women. The definition of equitable treatment in STEM today is that corporate demographics must mirror the USA population distribution 50-50. But why not the 70-30 or any other distribution among populations that might be studied? The problem with choosing the, quote, wrong population, the 70-30 distribution, is that redistribution doctrine would not yield any differing results other than what free choice and equality of opportunity has already provisioned for with openness to individual decision-making. Therefore, the oppression narrative would completely fall apart. But this also deserves a whole other video. To repeat, Step 3 is the intransigent feminist push for increased female representation in technical studies at university, corporate management positions, higher starting pay, larger raise increments, and executive-level leadership. Step 4, the government gets involved. Mirroring the priorities of loud groups claiming victimization, the government creates corporate financial incentives or punishments with aim to generate the radical change demanded by its own constituents. Why would the government mirror such priorities? First, politicians have an incentive to get reelected. The reelection process relies in part on cultural popularity. But if a loud, intransigent group is all a politician can hear, then it makes sense to go along with political priorities that a politician may themselves neither fully understand nor even believe. Second, the government has no customers to answer to and always gets its money. From you, I might add. This alleviates the burden to control costs that a regular business might incur from hiring lackluster talent in excess, enables the government to lower or bypass entirely any merit-based standards that may outright disqualify applicants in a private company. This is a feedback loop in and of itself, which has yielded ever-expanding government, key positions being forfeited to political radicals, and an overall shift in political priorities toward non-traditional aims of federal institutions. In order to overcome the natural forces of a free market economy in favor of equitable distributionism, a government must give direct incentive in the form of tax credits, contract terms, or overt penalty in order to coax the market into favoring group membership-based merit over individual qualification and competency. Ultimately, this results in women being placed higher up in social hierarchies solely based on womanhood, rather than traditional benchmarks of competence like years of experience, product knowledge, degree type, relevant job skill set, or leadership soft skills. And let me just take a break from my own text to say, this doesn't mean that there aren't women out there who meet these things. I mean, I just talked about earlier that, there is a population one could study about the, male and female applicants to STEM fields. And, I personally have worked with a lot of really brilliant female engineers, and they're great. At the same time, I have also worked with a fair number of female engineers who let's just say, are certainly on par with some of the poor male engineers that I've worked with as well. The point of this paragraph is to talk about individual merit versus, the government coming in and trying to make everything fair, and kind of the pros and cons of that. So let's go ahead and continue. The listener may be upset with this and shake their head in disbelief. Let me highlight an example. About 3 years after I left the first aerospace company I worked for, they instituted a gender quota for both technical and non-technical management positions. Since they did not have enough technical female staff to reach the desired outcome, they ended up promoting new college graduates or graduates with only 1 to 2 years of experience in non-technical fields to manage teams composed of individuals with 7 to 10 years of technical experience plus a technical degree. Suffice it to say, morale among the most competent staff was lowered, employee attrition problems ensued, technical promotions and opportunities became scarce, and competition was relegated to biological group distinction as opposed to individual performance. Allow me to recap the feedback loop steps thus far. Men's actions are motivated by interest in women. Women seek the most suitable men based generally on social status, across or above. Feminism pushes for women to obtain historical retribution in the form of social status upgrades in the very hierarchy that they use to identify suitable males. Government power is wielded to make this happen against free market forces. What does this mean for women? It means that they ultimately have a much smaller portion of men that they deem as suitable for relationships and family. What does this mean for men? Step 5 of the feedback loop consists of men sacrificing independence and masculinity by acquiescing socially to every female complaint and demand in an attempt to win sexual success by appeasement. Men will boldly proclaim, "Yes, I am part of the problem. I'm not like those other misogynists. I'll do whatever you say and beckon to every woman call. I shall pay your rent, so your demanded 20% raise will make you more stunning and brave. I'll take you wherever you want to go. Your time is so important to me. I'm such a good guy. I'll ask for consent with every intimate advance." Meanwhile, this tends to show even lower social status and result in less appeal to women. On top of that, the men in the upper echelons of social standing are the very epitome and embodiment of what feminists complain about with toxic masculinity, patriarchy, oppression, etc. What a bizarre situation. A large majority of women are given inflated social standing, meaning they are only willing to pursue the smaller proportion of men. Ironically, the very same men claim to be holding them back. The large majority of men will end up in 2 categories. The first category is they make themselves less attractive to women by folding to every feminine demand. Ironically, what tends to garner the attention of women as well as differentiate men among other men are actions to the complete opposite of female appeasement. The second category men might end up in is men end up checking out of the market entirely due to successive failures with women and a desire to find meaning in other things they are passionate about. This second part is not an awful option in terms of finding other meaningful things to be passionate about. So now let me return to the question, why does Prawn become an addiction? Why does it captivate so many users? Why have men checked out of dating and buried themselves in fantasy? Keeping the aforementioned feedback loop in mind, the short answer is because the average man can't compete with the social hierarchy advancements of modern women. Through a combination of feminism and mirrored government policy, women have competed themselves out of the market for the majority of men. But note that women aren't doing anything inherently wrong. In their view, they are just operating with their free desires in response to the landscape in front of them. Women's free desire for across or up, based on an assessment of their own position relative to other men, and men's position to each other in social hierarchies, simply disqualifies the vast majority of men immediately, without even taking into consideration all the other potential disqualifiers that may occur in the actual process of dating once a woman decides to go on one. So, men turn to a dark place for an outlet, for fake female attention, to imagine themselves in a position where they not only have sexual access, but an imagined desire from the opposite sex. It is all indeed imaginary, and a shirking of responsibility as a man to improve oneself financially and spiritually, but it is easy. A female listener will likely now complain. Men just need to be better. I might agree to a certain extent. A man is always improving. A man makes sacrifices for family and country. A man considers himself expendable and in turn becomes indispensable. And a man does things that many other men, but especially women, do not have the desire to do. The disagreement is that we, men, may not be interested in doing all that stuff for women who have no respect or appreciation for those aspects of masculinity anymore. That said, men have been improving themselves. I love watching how the manosphere has evolved in online spaces. We did what men always do when society shuns us. We built a new society. Many great men have helped build the social circles outside of feminist complaint, offering counseling and advisement without judgment, and a place to share ideas and dispute. An online man cave, if you will. The problem is, we know it will take us many years to build up the stature to compete in an inflated market successfully. In the meantime, Prawn will continue to be a problem, as will men trying to appease for intimacy. Prawn's negative effects will also in turn be felt by women. In fact, it is arguable that prawn affects women even worse than men, another topic for another day. All in all, women can help get masculinity back as well, and it's easier than they think. All they must do is start acting more like traditional women again. Understand that men want to sacrifice for you, but we also need women to sacrifice for us, albeit in different ways. And just to add on to that, outside of what I wrote, it's possible for women to have, traditional attributes without, completely sacrificing all the things that, women's rights activists have claimed they fought so hard to obtain. People in general should all still be afforded the same rights, but as a woman, it doesn't hurt to know things like how to cook and, having just kind of a desire to have children in general. I mean, I know I've talked to a lot of women who really dislike the idea of even having children these days. To most men who, want that sort of thing, which a lot of men really do, that's kind of a turnoff. So again, it's not like we're talking about, going completely back to, certain eras of where there actually was oppression of women in history, but, there's men are still taking on or trying to take on their masculine roles. But it seems like many women have kind of lost the sense of what femininity really entails. In sum, pornography captivated the minds of so many men today due to a combination of market-based, government-based, and culturally based inputs or incentives. The overall interests of each respective arm may overlap in many ways, thus giving the appearance of a coordinated narrative. Corporate advertising to men using their longing for a sense of desire from women in combination with female sexuality acts as a powerful market force to influence men toward alternatives to dating that are less expensive both fiscally and emotionally. In the cultural real-world markets, men struggle to compete against the increasing standards of hypergamy and the increased options of women to pursue a smaller and extremely successful pool of men. The selection criteria that women utilize to sift through men is artificially more stringent as a consequence of government forcefully redistributing socioeconomic status in an equity-based program, which has granted women access to economic and social status that is on average higher than their male peers. Attempting to obtain the best of both worlds, many men confuse the government push for equity as a reflection of the true desires of women, thus adopting more passive and agreeable natures that often turn women off. At the same time, many men will also be completely satisfied to sacrifice less for real-world dating when the desire for sexual intimacy can be more safely, cheaply, and readily obtained digitally. In addition, many other men choose to pursue excellence outside of sexual achievement. The aggregate of each of these demographics is a significant proportion of men who all consume illicit material as a coping mechanism or direct alternative to traditional relationships. Thus, pornography thrives from a business point of view, and the government obtains compensation in the form of questionless adoption of policy from women. Why wouldn't they? And significantly less pushback from men who are worried about violating forced social norms or who have checked out of relationships entirely. All right, guys. So that is all I wrote down for this particular topic, and there's a couple of subtopics that I plan on making other videos about. And I want to stress something before I close this video. This video is not supposed to say that anyone, regardless of gender, needs to be deprived of any rights or anything like that, that they currently hold. It's just meant to be a discussion about, my opinion on why I think pornography has become such a prominent, I would say, problem for men. And it's also even a problem with women, which I know for women, I should say, which I know I mentioned that I will talk about in a different video. But all in all, it's easy to see why someone would think that there would be a conspiracy because, both the companies and government are benefiting from some of the same consequences of excessive use of pornography and consumption of pornography. But what I would say is I don't necessarily think that there's some like grand collusion. I just think that it's oftentimes with government programs that they, produce unintended consequences or, have effects that can't really be judged or measured at, kind of the onset of policy adoption. And I think in this case, one of them is simply that, men don't really have a huge incentive anymore to date traditionally because, for lack of better words, it's, kind of a pain in the rear end. And one thing we didn't even talk about in the video is, what happens with government marriage incentives and things like that. Now, I'm a firm believer in marriage. I think that marriage is important. I think that having kids is important. There's inherent risks in everything that a person does. And I'm a big proponent of men realizing what risks they have and taking risks and things like that. But unfortunately, there's risk for women too, but when the government gets involved, it just makes those risks kind of lopsided. I would say men, particularly financially, and, maybe even to a certain degree, physically, are taking on a significant amount of risk with marriage with, arguably limited rewards. If you just think about it from a common sense point of view, it's like if you're a man, let's say you're a woman watching this and you want to put yourself in a man's shoes for a second. It's like, okay, I get rejected by women constantly. I'm, always trying to do things to improve myself, but it never seems to be enough. I think that I'm just going to, focus on other aspects of my life and, stop worrying about dating and relationships because it's just really depressing for me and I'm not really getting anywhere. If you think about it from that perspective, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. If a man says to himself, well, I can get the intimacy needs met with, free other ways that aren't as much work, it's just kind of a no-brainer why, men are pursuing what, I will fully admit are, not the best or pretty toxic options for, getting intimacy. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm sure this video offended a bunch of people, and that's okay. Leave your comments below. We'll talk about it if you have your own perspective on the matter. Also, leave your comment below, and we'll talk about that, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Thanks. Later.